Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories. When Clara first stepped through the creaky white gate of the ivy-covered cottage, she felt a flicker of hope, a breath of fresh possibility. The move was meant to be a new beginning for her and Ethan, a quiet retreat from the pressures of city life and his grueling hours at the firm. The house, though modest, had a rustic charm: weathered shutters, a tiny rose garden blooming defiantly near the porch, and a wraparound fence that whispered of simpler times. Clara imagined lazy mornings in the sunlit kitchen, evenings wrapped in Ethan's arms beside the fireplace. But the real surprise came in the form of Victor Gray, the landlord. He was older, silver at the temples, with a voice like warm bourbon and an unsettling calm in his gaze. "Anything you need, just call," he said that first day, handing her the keys with a smile that lingered too long. She didn't think much of it then. He was just being polite, she reasoned. After all, they were new tenants in a close-knit town. But something in his eyes, in the way he watched her, made Clara's skin prickle with unease. She didn't know it yet, but Victor Gray was going to change everything. It started subtly, so subtly Clara almost didn't notice. With Ethan gone most days, buried in meetings and case files, she often found herself alone in the house, filling her time with chores, books, and long, thoughtful walks through the garden. That's when Victor began to appear more frequently. First, it was under the guise of landlord duties, checking the boiler, trimming the hedges, repairing a squeaky stair. But gradually, his visits took on a different tone. He lingered longer. He brought fresh bread from the local bakery, claiming he had too much. He asked questions, gentle but probing. "Are you settling in all right? Is Ethan home much these days?" His voice was always kind, but his gaze lingered in ways that unsettled her. One afternoon, Clara was pruning roses when she heard his footsteps behind her. She turned surprised, her hands dirt-streaked and raw from the thorns. Victor smiled, holding out a pair of gloves. "Thought you could use these," he said softly. His fingers brushed hers, just a moment too long. She thanked him politely, but her heart beat a little faster. That night, she told herself she was overthinking it, that he was simply being considerate. But the truth was harder to ignore. His presence felt like something else entirely. And as the days passed and Ethan remained buried in his work, Victor's visits became the one constant. Clara didn't know if it was concern or something deeper, but she couldn't deny the ripple of awareness that curled through her whenever he was near. It was a quiet Thursday morning when Clara realized how deeply the lines of routine had been etched into her life. The scent of fresh coffee wafted through the kitchen, but it felt hollow, like everything else these days. Ethan had already left. He always did before sunrise, chasing deadlines and decisions that seemed more important than home. Clara sat alone at the table, staring at her untouched toast, her thoughts adrift. That was when the knock came, 3 soft taps against the door. Victor. Of course. He stood there with a knowing smile and a box of pastries from the downtown cafe, the one she once mentioned loving. "Thought you could use a treat," he said, his voice warm. She hesitated only a moment before letting him in. Over coffee they talked, not just small talk, but stories that felt like confessions. She told him about her dreams once shelved, about the emptiness that echoed louder than silence in her home. Victor listened, truly listened, his eyes never leaving hers. And for a fleeting moment, Clara felt seen, more than just a wife or a hostess. She felt real. Alive. The moment lingered longer than it should have, the air between them thick with something unspoken. When he left, she leaned against the door, heart racing. It was harmless, she told herself. Just a conversation. But the tremble in her fingertips and the heat in her chest told a different story. This was the beginning of something, uncertain, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. The sun hung low in the sky as Clara sat in the backyard, her hands buried in the garden soil, pretending to focus on the withering lavender she was replanting. In truth, her thoughts were tangled elsewhere, specifically with the man who had become a regular fixture in her quiet life. Victor had stopped by again earlier that day, this time bringing a replacement light bulb for the porch, an excuse surely. But it wasn't the bulb that lingered in Clara's mind, it was the way his fingers had brushed against hers when she handed him the old one, the look in his eyes when he asked how she was really doing. It was the way he noticed the books she left open, the tired slump in her shoulders, the stories she hadn't meant to tell. Ethan hadn't asked how she was in weeks. Maybe longer. Clara dug her fingers into the earth, trying to silence the flutter in her chest that had become too familiar. She wasn't foolish, she knew what this was.
Emotionalerosion.
A slow crumble of loyalty replaced by longing, not just for attention but for validation, for warmth. Victor gave her that, even without trying. And as the breeze whispered through the trees and dusk settled in, Clara felt it again, that pulse of restlessness in her veins. Guilt pricked at her, but it wasn't enough to smother the truth. She was starting to crave the feeling she only seemed to find in Victor's presence. And that terrified her. It was a quiet Thursday evening when everything shifted. Clara stood in the kitchen, bathed in the golden light of sunset, stirring a pot of soup that simmered gently on the stove. The house felt unusually still. Ethan was out of town again, his usual string of terse texts marking his presence more out of obligation than affection. She wasn't expecting anyone. So when the doorbell rang, it startled her, snapping her from the rhythm of solitude she had grown too comfortable with. She wiped her hands and opened the door to find Victor standing there, holding a small potted plant, lavender, the very one she had mentioned was dying in her garden. "Thought this might cheer up your porch," he said with that familiar half-smile, the kind that made her chest tighten and her breath hitch. Clara hesitated but stepped aside, letting him in. They stood together in the kitchen, their conversation drifting from gardening tips to memories, laughter slipping through the cracks of loneliness like sunlight through blinds. The moment was simple, yet loaded, each word, each glance, laced with something unspoken. When Victor reached to help her chop vegetables, their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. The silence that followed was thick with electricity. Clara's heart pounded, not from fear, but from a dangerous clarity. She should have stepped back. She didn't. Instead, she let the closeness bloom into something too intimate for the quiet kitchen. It was the beginning of a line blurred, a boundary crossed with nothing more than a breath. The days that followed were a haze of confusion and whispered temptations. Clara found herself glancing at the clock more often, subconsciously calculating how many hours until Victor might stop by again. It wasn't that she sought him out, at least that's what she told herself, but somehow he was always there. Fixing the leaky faucet Ethan hadn't touched in months. Bringing by fresh herbs from the market. Asking questions that Ethan never did. "What did you dream of becoming before life got in the way?" he asked one afternoon, as they sat on the back steps sipping iced tea. No one had asked her that in years. And just like that, something stirred inside her, something reckless and long dormant. She told herself nothing had happened. Not really.
A brush of hands.
A gaze that lingered too long. Laughter that felt too sweet. But the guilt bloomed in her chest like a bruise. Ethan came home briefly that weekend, and Clara tried, she really did. She cooked his favorite meal, wore the perfume he used to compliment. But he barely looked up from his laptop, mumbling thanks and disappearing into his office before dessert. The silence between them stretched like a fault line. And in that space, Victor's voice echoed louder. His compliments. His attention. The way he made her feel seen. It terrified her. And thrilled her. Clara stood at the edge of something she couldn't name, her marriage on one side, and on the other, the magnetic pull of a man who wasn't hers. Not yet. But dangerously close. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when the tension finally cracked the surface. Clara had spent the morning restlessly pacing the house, her nerves frayed and her thoughts spiraling. The moment Victor appeared at the door, she knew she should have turned him away. But she didn't. She never did. He stepped inside with that same casual confidence, asking if she needed help replacing a light bulb in the hallway. It was absurd, really, how easily he inserted himself into the most mundane parts of her life. But when he climbed the step stool and glanced down at her with that half-smile, something shifted in the air between them. He came down slowly, the silence between them heavier than the space itself. Clara backed toward the wall, heart pounding. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying it would make it true. But Victor stepped closer, closing the gap with agonizing patience. "Then why haven't you stopped me?" he murmured. And in that breathless moment, Clara didn't have an answer. Their kiss was sudden, an explosion of every suppressed emotion, every stolen glance, every buried desire. It was messy, desperate, and laced with all the guilt Clara had tried to deny. When she pulled away, breathless and trembling, Victor didn't say a word. He simply looked at her with quiet understanding, like he had known it would happen all along. As the door clicked shut behind him minutes later, Clara sank to the floor, her hand to her lips. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The aftermath was not immediate chaos, but a slow unraveling, the kind that made every moment feel sharpened with dread. Clara tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She cooked dinner that night, carefully measuring spices, forcing her hands to stay steady. Ethan returned home from work with his usual tired smile, kissing her on the cheek like always, unaware that his wife was breaking quietly from the inside out. As they sat across from each other at the table, Clara couldn't meet his eyes. Every glance felt like a confession, every word she spoke a betrayal. Victor's kiss lingered on her lips like a ghost. She couldn't stop thinking about it, the heat of it, the way it made her feel alive and wanted and shamefully reckless. She hadn't planned for any of it. But now, it consumed her. When Ethan asked about her day, she lied without flinching. "Just quiet," she said. Victor came by to fix the hallway light. "Good," Ethan replied casually, not noticing the subtle flinch in her shoulders. That night, as Ethan slept soundly beside her, Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling. The weight of what she had done pressed on her chest like a stone. She felt like she was losing herself, becoming a version of Clara she no longer recognized. But what haunted her most wasn't the guilt. It was the terrifying thrill she had felt when Victor kissed her, the part of her that had leaned in, not away. And that part wasn't done yet. In the days that followed, Clara found herself spiraling into a web of secrecy and self-deception. Every morning began with a mask, a carefully composed smile, a cheerful kiss on Ethan's cheek, and a promise of a normal day. But nothing about her life felt normal anymore.
Victor's presence lingered like a shadow.
Even when he wasn't there, she felt him. His voice echoed in her thoughts, his words pulling at parts of her that had been buried under years of domestic monotony. One afternoon, Clara found herself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. Her fingers brushed the edge of her lips, remembering the way they had moved against Victor's. She hated herself for it. And yet, she craved it. The tension between guilt and desire was tearing her apart. She tried to distract herself, running errands, organizing cabinets, cooking elaborate meals, but nothing quieted the storm inside. Ethan, ever trusting, never questioned her. He was working late again, his hours swallowed by endless meetings and deadlines. Clara told herself that he wouldn't understand, that this emptiness had begun long before Victor arrived. Still, she avoided his gaze, afraid he might see the truth lurking behind her eyes. Then came the text. Just 4 words from Victor: "Can't stop thinking about you."
Claras Brief kaukt.
Her fingers hovered over the screen, torn between deleting it and responding. She didn't reply. But she didn't delete it either. Because even in her silence, she was still holding on. And some part of her didn't want to let go. The line Clara had been so desperate not to cross had already blurred beyond recognition. What started as fleeting moments of tension and hesitant touches had transformed into something more dangerous, more intimate. One quiet evening, while Ethan was away on a last-minute work trip, Victor stopped by under the guise of dropping off a forgotten lease document. Clara should have turned him away, should have never let him inside. But she didn't. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and the silence that followed was more deafening than words. They stood across from each other in the living room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan the only sound between them. Clara's breath caught when Victor stepped closer, his eyes searching hers as if waiting for a sign. She gave it, just a flicker, a glance, and that was all it took. Their kiss wasn't careful this time. It wasn't a slip or a mistake. It was fire, desperate and consuming. She felt his hands tangle in her hair, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, and in that moment, all the fear, guilt, and boundaries vanished. They didn't speak, didn't reason. They simply gave in. Afterward, they sat in the stillness, both shaken by what they had allowed to happen. Clara wrapped a blanket around herself, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the enormity of what they'd done. Victor reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Because now it wasn't just temptation. It was betrayal, fully realized. The days that followed blurred into a haze of guilt and second-guessing. Clara moved through her routine as though she were outside of herself, watching a stranger pretend to be a wife, a homemaker, a woman unshaken. But inside, she was unraveling. The memory of Victor's touch haunted her, every quiet moment, every soft corner of the house where shadows gathered, held a memory she couldn't erase. She tried to act normal when Ethan returned home, smiling at the right times, laughing at his dry jokes over dinner. But she felt his eyes lingering on her longer than usual, searching for something. Had he noticed? Had he sensed the shift? One morning, as Clara folded laundry by the window, she noticed Ethan in the backyard staring at the garden fence. The same one Victor had helped her repair weeks ago. Ethan's brow was furrowed, his hands shoved into his pockets. That simple image, the man she had vowed to love, standing so unaware of the fracture beneath their life, shattered something inside her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Guilt pressed heavy on her chest, stealing her breath. She turned away from Ethan's touch in bed, her heart thudding like a warning bell. Then came the message. Victor. We need to talk. Clara stared at the screen, her hands trembling. One choice had already changed everything. But what came next? That was the real question, the one clawing at her in the dark, begging for an answer she was too afraid to give. Clara stared at her phone long after the screen went dark, Victor's message still echoing in her thoughts like a whisper she couldn't silence. We need to talk. The words felt like a door swinging open to a path she knew she shouldn't walk, but couldn't seem to resist. The next afternoon, she found herself driving across town to a quiet cafe tucked between a bookstore and a florist, a place that felt far removed from the world she shared with Ethan. Victor was already there, seated at a corner table, his eyes locked on hers the moment she walked in. There was no pretense, no small talk. Just silence thick with everything unsaid. You're not sleeping, he said softly, his voice tinged with concern. I can see it in your eyes. Clara sat down slowly, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. What do you want from me, Victor? He leaned in, his gaze intense.
Uncensored. Note version you preten to life in front of Ethan.
The truth only you and I know exists. Her breath hitched. Because he was right. There was a truth between them, raw, forbidden, and undeniable. But acknowledging it meant dismantling everything she'd built with Ethan. I didn't come here to make excuses, she said. But I can't stop thinking about you. Victor's expression softened, but the tension didn't ease. In that moment, Clara realized she was no longer just balancing lies. She was living two lives, and sooner or later, one would destroy the other. The storm finally came, not with thunder, but with a quiet, aching confrontation in their living room. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly, eyes haunted and tired. Clara stood across from him, arms folded, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every clock tick in the house. She had rehearsed 100 versions of this moment, but none of them prepared her for the rawness in his voice. I found the messages, Ethan said, his voice hoarse. Victor. The visits. The lies.
How long, Clara?
She didn't deny it. Couldn't. There was no point weaving another web when the truth had already broken through. Too long, she whispered. But not because I wanted to hurt you. Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. But you did. You broke something in me I'm not sure I can put back together. Tears filled her eyes.
I was lonely, Ethan.
You were gone even when you were here. I didn't recognize us anymore. And you found him, he said, the words sharp and cold. In the cracks I left behind. She stepped closer. I never stopped loving you, but I stopped feeling seen. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure which way the wind would push. Ethan stood, pain etched in every movement. I don't know what comes next, he said, voice low. But we can't stay like this. As he walked out the door, Clara knew this was no longer about blame, it was about whether love could survive the ruins. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy for emotional distance to quietly settle into relationships. We often assume love alone is enough, but without communication, presence, and vulnerability, even the strongest bonds can crack. This story reminds us how vital it is to truly see each other, to notice the silences, the small shifts, the unmet needs before they become emotional voids. Don't wait for betrayal to force a conversation. Prioritize connection. Talk honestly. Show up for each other, not just physically, but emotionally. Because sometimes, what breaks a relationship isn't one big moment, but all the little moments left unattended.